In the stillness of a foggy winter morning, Bletchley Park seemed more like a forgotten manor than the heart of a silent war. Its vast, ivy-clad walls and sprawling gardens betrayed none of the monumental activity hidden within. The world outside continued its march toward destruction, but inside the estate, a different battle was being fought. It was a war of words, of hidden meanings, of cryptic messages that could alter the future of nations. The people waging this war were mostly unknown to the world. Men and women, some of whom had never even been considered for battle, were risking their sanity and their health to outwit the Nazis. They were not soldiers in uniform, but mathematicians, linguists, and even school teachers. Their weapon, a series of codes. The German military, with its vast network of encrypted communications, had created a nearly impenetrable fortress of secrecy. The Enigma machine, a device so advanced it seemed foolproof, was the key to the Nazis' secure messaging system. Every day, thousands of messages were sent across Europe, planning battles, coordinating troops, and signaling orders. All of them were encrypted, all of them wrapped in layers of mathematical complexity. But there was one problem. The Enigma machine wasn't perfect. It could be cracked, but it would take someone with an understanding of mathematics, logic, and the human mind's ability to spot patterns where others saw only chaos. For most of the world, the Enigma machine was just a puzzle. But for the men and women at Bletchley Park, it was an obsession. Inside the estate's seemingly mundane walls, under the watchful eyes of a few military officers, a revolution in information warfare was taking place. A group of minds, working in isolation from the world, were beginning to unravel a code that would soon hold the key to victory. The people working there had no idea of the importance of their efforts. To the outside world, they were simply filling out reports, analyzing intercepted messages, and decoding what seemed like random strings of letters. But beneath the surface, something much deeper was occurring. There were no great speeches, no leaders rallying the troops, no moment of singular brilliance. Instead, the work at Bletchley Park was a slow grind, a marathon of monotonous repetition. The women, who had been relegated to the background of society and the workforce, found themselves in a rare position of power. They were the unsung heroes, using their minds to do what the world believed only men could accomplish. Yet, as they decoded messages one by one, their work was almost invisible. Their contributions were overshadowed by the fact that they were not on the battlefield, and their gender rendered them overlooked. These women, mostly clerks, translators, and typists, were doing the same work as their male counterparts, often far more difficult work, but the world would never know their names. Among the more notable figures was Joan Clark, a young mathematician whose intellect was undeniable. Yet, despite her extraordinary skills, she was continually relegated to the role of an assistant, rather than given the recognition she deserved. Clark was one of the few women allowed to work directly with Alan Turing, the genius who would eventually be known for his development of the bomb, a machine designed to break the Enigma code. She was brilliant, but her gender was seen as a barrier in a world where intellectual work was still largely dominated by men. The story of Joan Clark, much like that of her colleagues, would be buried under the weight of historical erasure, a testament to how the structures of power often fail to recognize genius that does not fit the mold of what is considered acceptable. The people at Bletchley Park were not only engaged in one of the most secretive and important operations of the war, but they were also learning the brutal lesson that innovation could thrive in obscurity. There was no fanfare, no recognition, no validation for the work they were doing. They were cutting-edge pioneers in a field that barely existed at the time, the study of cryptography and computational theory. Yet, to the world beyond the gates of Bletchley, they were simply unknown figures. Even as their work slowly turned the tide of the war, the men and women working at Bletchley found themselves isolated, working not just in silence, but in secrecy so tight that even their families knew little of the work they were doing. It wasn't just the absence of recognition that weighed on them. It was the almost absolute invisibility of their efforts. This secrecy was necessary, of course. The work they were doing was far too important to be exposed. But there was also something soul-crushing about the silence they endured. They were writing the script for a new world, one where technology and human intellect would become the dominant forces of power. But they were doing so in a world that only acknowledged traditional forms of battle: tanks, airplanes, and soldiers. No one was watching as they pored over reams of paper filled with intercepted German messages, each one an encrypted labyrinth they had to untangle. And even when they succeeded, their triumphs went unnoticed, swept into the folds of government secrecy. As the months passed, the pressure at Bletchley mounted. The war was intensifying. The Luftwaffe continued its bombings, and the Allied forces were struggling to hold their ground. With each passing day, the team at Bletchley knew that their work could make the difference between life and death for thousands, maybe millions. Yet, the work itself remained a quiet, obsessive struggle. It was a battle of willpower more than anything else. The toll it took on the minds of the people involved was devastating. Long hours, endless repetitions, and the constant pressure of knowing that failure could mean catastrophe. These were the daily realities for those at Bletchley. Many struggled with the isolation, the secrecy, and the crushing knowledge that even if they succeeded, they might never be celebrated for their achievements. Turing himself was a paradox, a man whose brilliance would later shape the world of computing. He was at Bletchley Park not just fighting to crack the enigma, but to prove something far deeper to himself and to society. He was an outsider in many ways, his sexual orientation something that would later lead to his persecution. He understood how critical his work was, but he also knew that the world was not yet ready to accept him. This was a man who knew that his legacy would not be celebrated during his lifetime. Yet, he pushed forward, driven by a sense of duty to the greater good, knowing that if he failed, the consequences would be dire. Amidst the work, there were fleeting moments of camaraderie and connection. For all the secrecy, the people at Bletchley shared a bond forged in the crucible of their work. They were not just fighting for the survival of their country. They were fighting to be recognized as people who mattered, who contributed in ways that were as significant as any soldier on the front lines. They were rewriting the very definition of warfare, transforming it from a physical battle into a battle of ideas and intelligence. And yet, even as they cracked Enigma's code bit by bit, they were denied the recognition they deserved. The world would eventually learn the truth, but it would be a long time before they would know the depth of the sacrifice, the innovation, and the heroism that had taken place behind those quiet, ivy-clad walls. The puzzle was nearly solved, but the cost of that knowledge was high. These were not the kinds of heroes that the world knew how to honor. They were simply the code-breakers, faceless figures who had changed the course of history, only to fade into obscurity. And with the war still raging, there was no time to reflect on their accomplishments, no time to celebrate what had been achieved. They continued, day by day, caught in a paradox of success and erasure. The enigma had nearly been cracked, but at what cost to those who had brought this victory about? In the heart of Bletchley Park, the atmosphere was electric with quiet desperation. The world outside was crumbling under the weight of war, but here, inside the walls of this nondescript estate, there was a new kind of battle taking place. The Allies were struggling on multiple fronts, their lines of communication intercepted by the German military and secured by the nearly impossible-to-break Enigma machine. It seemed like an insurmountable task. Yet within the labyrinth of this seemingly impenetrable code, a solution was beginning to take shape, a solution that would alter the course of history. At the center of it all was Alan Turing, a man whose name would later echo through the corridors of history as the father of modern computing. Turing was a paradox in every sense. A mathematician by training, he was socially awkward, emotionally distant, and misunderstood by many of his colleagues. He didn't fit the mold of the conventional hero, but that was part of what made him so uniquely qualified to tackle the problem of the Enigma machine. Where others saw an obstacle, Turing saw only patterns, logic, and an almost fanatical drive to unravel the secret of the Nazi code. His brilliance lay in his ability to think in ways that no one else could. Turing's vision wasn't just about brute force. It wasn't about memorizing codebook after codebook or running through thousands of permutations by hand. It was about creating a machine, an automated device that could think, reason, and calculate faster than any human could. The machine, which would come to be known as the bomb, was a prototype of what we would later call the computer. It was an audacious idea, and it was rooted in a bold understanding of mathematics and logic. At the time, the very idea of a machine that could think for itself was seen as preposterous. Yet, for Turing, it wasn't just a theoretical concept, it was a necessity. His machine would not only solve the Enigma's cryptographic puzzle, but it would also change the nature of warfare, making information itself the most powerful weapon of all. Despite his groundbreaking ideas, Turing wasn't a man of great social skills. He was not a polished speaker, nor was he interested in ingratiating himself with the military officers who oversaw his work. His colleagues, too, found his behavior enigmatic. He could be abrupt, disinterested in small talk, and often absent in thought. His fixation on cracking the code consumed him entirely, and his obsession with the task at hand made him something of an outsider. He was a man who lived more in the world of ideas than in the world of people, and that set him apart in an environment where social hierarchy and authority were rigidly enforced. Yet his isolation didn't stop him from making his mark. Turing had something that his colleagues didn't: a vision of the future. As he worked tirelessly in his cramped office, he began to develop the concepts that would eventually lead to the bomb. The machine wasn't just about decoding messages. It was about challenging the very structure of war itself. For Turing, the Enigma was more than just an obstacle. It was a test of humanity's intellectual capacity, a test that, if passed, would alter the nature of conflict. In this quiet corner of Bletchley Park, Turing was laying the groundwork for what would later become the digital age. But while Turing was developing his vision, others at Bletchley were grappling with their own roles in this clandestine war. Joan Clark, a brilliant mathematician, was one of the few women allowed to work directly with Turing. Her skills were undeniable, yet her presence was almost always secondary to that of her male colleagues. In a world where women were still largely confined to domestic roles, Clark's intellectual prowess was constantly dismissed, even though her contributions were invaluable. She had the rare privilege of working side by side with Turing, but even then, she was often sidelined, her achievements going largely unnoticed. Yet, despite the institutional blindness to her genius, Clark remained focused on the task at hand, pushing forward with the same relentless determination as Turing. For Clark, the work at Bletchley was not just a job. It was a personal mission. She wasn't just a cog in a machine, but a vital part of an effort that would change the world. But her reality was one of constant struggle, not just with the Enigma, but with the limitations placed on her because of her gender. She was often ignored by her superiors, her contributions overlooked in favor of the male codebreakers who dominated the upper echelons of the operation. It was a bitter irony that the very people working to unlock the greatest secrets of the war were the same people whose own achievements would be hidden away in history's shadows. The tension at Bletchley was palpable. The work was exhausting, often done under extreme pressure, and the stakes were impossibly high. Every day, the team faced the reality that if they failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Germans were closing in on the Eastern Front, and the Allied forces were struggling to hold their own. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, and the Nazis were gaining ground in North Africa. Time was running out. Yet, in the midst of this pressure, the team at Bletchley kept pushing forward. It was a battle not just of intellect, but of willpower. Meanwhile, the bomb was taking shape. Turing, along with his team, managed to build a machine that could process the cryptographic permutations faster than any human could. The bomb worked by testing possible Enigma settings against known words, revealing the key to the encryption. It was a breakthrough, one that would later prove to be a turning point in the war. But it was also a turning point for Turing himself. The creation of the bomb was the product of years of relentless work and countless failures. It was a triumph not just of technical innovation, but of human resilience. However, there was still no public acknowledgement of the significance of Turing's work. Despite the brilliance of the bomb and the progress that had been made in cracking the Enigma code, the secrecy surrounding Bletchley Park remained absolute. The work was deemed too important to be shared with the outside world. Even though Turing and his colleagues knew they were on the verge of something monumental, there was no fanfare, no recognition. They were isolated, working in a vacuum, with no guarantee that their efforts would ever see the light of day. For Turing, the bomb was more than just a machine, it was his lifeline. His obsession with the Enigma code had consumed him, and his work had become his singular purpose. Yet, even as he neared the final stages of the project, there was a growing sense of doubt. The war was not yet won, and the codebreakers knew that their work was far from over. The pressure to deliver was immense, and the toll it was taking on Turing was becoming apparent. He was, in many ways, his own worst enemy, his mind constantly racing, his body worn down from the relentless strain of the task. But amid the tension and isolation, there was a quiet camaraderie among the codebreakers. They were a team, bound together by a shared mission, a mission that was far greater than any one individual. They understood the importance of their work, even if the world outside would never recognize their efforts. And, slowly but surely, they were beginning to crack the code. The bomb wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of the incredible human capacity for innovation. It was a testament to the idea that intelligence and ingenuity could overcome even the most insurmountable obstacles. And for those at Bletchley Park, it was a reminder that the war they were fighting wasn't just on the battlefield. It was a war of ideas, a war for the future. But as Turing and his team neared their goal, there was an unsettling sense that the victory they were on the brink of achieving would come at a great personal cost. The world may have been changing, but at Bletchley Park, the people who were shaping that change were still fighting their own battles in silence. Their triumphs, while monumental, remained locked away in the shadows, awaiting a recognition that would come far too late. The war was over. The world had seen the fall of Nazi Germany and the collapse of the Axis powers, but for those inside the walls of Bletchley Park, the victory was bittersweet. The aftermath of the war was filled with celebration and relief for many, but for the men and women who had spent years breaking codes, cracking ciphers, and deciphering the secret language of war, there was no fanfare, no recognition. The contributions of these silent warriors would go largely unacknowledged, their names buried in the archives of history. Even as the world turned toward rebuilding, the heroes of Bletchley were left behind, their stories untold and their sacrifices forgotten. The impact of their work could not be overstated. The codebreakers had achieved what was once thought impossible. They had cracked the Enigma machine, one of the most complex and secure encryption systems ever devised. Their efforts had saved countless lives and shortened the war by years, perhaps even altering the course of history itself. But none of this was known to the public. The secrecy that had shrouded their work during the war was still in place, and the contributions of the codebreakers remained classified. The government had decided that the true nature of their work would never be revealed. The men and women who had worked tirelessly to turn the tide of the war were not to be celebrated as heroes. Instead, they were to remain faceless, invisible in the eyes of the world. Turing, the genius behind the bomb and the intellectual heart of Bletchley, was no exception. Though his work had been instrumental in cracking the Enigma code, he was not honored. In fact, his fate was nothing short of tragic. Despite his monumental contributions to the war effort, Turing was treated with indifference by the very society he had saved. His homosexuality, which was illegal in Britain at the time, led to his persecution. In 1952, Turing was arrested and charged with gross indecency after admitting to a homosexual relationship. He was given the choice of imprisonment or chemical castration, and he chose the latter, enduring a painful and humiliating process that would have long-lasting effects on his mental and physical health.